So basically, so far we covered, we started, as you said yesterday, all the way from Canaanites and till Nakba. So remember, Nakba was one of the biggest catastrophes in the modern Muslim, Arab, and of course Palestinian history. We learned a lot about what happened during yesterday's presentation, Dr. Sharif's presentation. So inshallah, today we're going to learn maybe a little bit more details, not details, a couple of incidents that happened during the Nakba. Dr. Jilani will tell us about that, and then we'll go ahead and discuss like some of the events that happened after. And I know the title was supposed to be 1973, but actually we'll take it a little bit further to the peace accords. To it will be 1979. I know, Jer, we're gonna talk about that. So it's almost 1970. Okay. All yours, Juhair. If you wanna go ahead and start.
Jazakallah khair. Bismillah wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. And Jazakallah khair for the introduction. And as Dr. Muhammad mentioned, we'll be covering sort of the events and incidents that occurred after 1948. And as you may know, after this time period, it was very politically inclined, very much, a lot of politics involved. So it's very important for us to understand what was the history behind, the modern politics that resulted into what we see today in Palestine, and who are the main figures involved in all these projects and all these processes. To begin with, inshallah, we'll go over really quick sort of a overview of what was in the Nakba. As you all may know, this was covered yesterday, but it was the displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. We have this narrative that they had migrated voluntarily, but the unfortunate truth is that they were ethnically cleansed and displaced from the lands of Palestine by the Zionist project, which already was taking place under the British mandate. And in terms of numbers, we know that by the first half of 1949, almost 1 million Palestinians, 750,000 Palestinians, were forcibly expelled from their homeland. And because of these events, we had the, quote unquote, state of Israel declare their statehood on May 15th, which also coincides with the day that we commemorate the Nakba and the cleansing and migration of Palestinians. And as a result of the Nakba, most of the refugees from the lands of Palestine had to flee into neighboring countries such as Jordan, and also Egypt and Syria. But that being said, around this time period, there are a couple of main stories that are occurring at the same time period. I want to focus on the Zaytun massacre that occurred in the same time period. And this was sort of very much an example of the policy that the Zionist terrorism was using and sort of leveraging in Palestine. So specifically around villages where there's a lot of Arabs and very urban areas, they were following and copy and pasting massacres across. And this city and this town, this was actually captured by Halamash, who is a terrorist group under a bigger terrorist group of the Zionists called Haganah. And this happened in May of 1948. And as a result of this, there was many males who actually fled the town as soon as they saw the Zionist terrorists coming in. And what happened, unfortunately, was that the people who were left in town, they were actually expelled by the forces, by the Israeli terrorists in the following days, many of whom were eventually just killed, who were unarmed Arabs. And by the end of this year, in 1948, this whole village was basically depopulated and no one was left in the town. Incident, this wasn't a one-off event, but in fact, this is something we see very similarly across other towns and other villages in the Palestinian land, which are now completely ran by Zionist government and Zionist individuals. So this is unfortunately one example of many different examples that occurred during this time period in the land of Palestine. A sort of reaction to this, a lot of these massacres and the Nakba, was there was definitely some interest and some sort of, individuals from the West who wanted to show support and bring peace to the land. So there was specifically a Swedish diplomat in the name of Folk Bernadotte, and he had killed and assassinated in September 17th of 1948 in Jerusalem. And this assassination was carried out by another terrorist Zionist group, this one called Lehi. And the important thing to notice is that all of these Zionist groups that were committing acts of terrorism in the Middle East, whether it was Lehi, Haganah, Palmach, so on and so forth, all of their leadership and all of their sort of, intelligence were actually future prime ministers and future political leadership of the Israeli Zionist government. So that's important to notice. The reason why he was assassinated was potentially because of his peace proposals. In his proposal, he had called for an immediate ceasefire, which is ironic, something we're also calling for to this day, 75 years later. And he also called for, to bring the Palestinian refugees back to where they were originally expelled from, back to the land that they came from and had lived in for generations and generations. He had also suggested that the city of Jerusalem would be under international control, not by the Zionist government. But because of this peace proposal, terrorist Zionist groups, who eventually, as I mentioned, became future political leaders and future prime ministers, carried out the assassination against them, and he died. He was killed as a result of it. Now, going into more sort of historical periods after the 1948 Nakba and that time, before we even begin going into the specific wars that took place in this time period, I think it's important to point out who was in power and who were the most important figures in this region. So we know that one of the most important figures is Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt since 1952. When he came into power through a military coup, which is basically when you have a government and the military actually takes over the government from the people who were elected or they were kings. So in this case, before Gamal Abdel Nasser, he was part of the military and he led the military to take over the government. So he took over a king's rule. The king was King Farouk, So the king lost his position, and Gamal Abdel Nasser came in together with the military to take over Egypt. He was very much a dictator as well, but he did have, was a very charismatic leader, and he was very popular across some parts of Egypt. In the middle, we have Nuruddin Abbasi, who is the president of Syria since 1966, and he, during 1966 and into the June War of 1967. Before he came into power, there was a lot of coups, a lot of corruption in Syria. And then for Al-Hussein bin Talal, he was a king since 1952 in Jordan. And during this time period, the king of Jordan, Al-Hussein, was actually very closely working with the British government. And all in all, during this time period in the Arab world, there was a lot of corruption and there's a lot of instability in the governments, because as the Arab world, all may know, the Ottoman Empire had fallen in the early parts of the 1900s, and into the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, a lot of war, a lot of corruption in the Arab world. And by the time it hit 1950, 1960, that corruption hadn't gone away, that those instability hadn't gone away, and there was still a lot of dictators and kings in this part of the world. So although there was colonialism in the 1920s, 1930s, there were still dictators after quote unquote independence in this part of the world. And one thing I'll note really quick is that in 1956, there's something called the Suez Canal crisis. What Gamal Abdel Nasser did was, at this time period, basically, you have a Suez Canal, which is a lot of resources next to Egypt. But these resources were actually ran by France and the UK, the France and United Kingdom, and there was also some collaboration with the state of Israel. So what Gamal Abdel Nasser did, based on the fact that a lot of resources and it'll benefit the Arab world and the Muslim world, and it'll help the economy of Egypt, he actually took over and nationalized the canal, meaning the canal was actually going to be part of the Egyptian economy now. And this obviously annoyed and really got France, the UK, and Israel mad, leading into some invasions and some attacks. And this sort of began a lot of the high tension between countries like Egypt and Israel. And what I'll point out is that prior to 1950s, 1960s, there was a lot of sentiment and sort of, unity across the Islamic world. We all wanted, we all knew that the Ottoman Caliphate was one bigger power that benefited all the Muslims. We began seeing that there was definitely people who were moving away from that, perspective, and they believed that we should focus on being together because we're all Arab. We need to focus together because we're all from Arab countries. And we saw an example of that in 1958. What that was we had Gamal Abdel Nasser and from Egypt and then from the Syrian leadership come together and create one country called United Arab Republic. And the United Arab Republic was a result of the Suez Canal crisis, in which Gamal had brought back Arab resources for the Arab people. And we began seeing that, now people are coming together to support Arab nationalism, which is defined sort of as this identity and unity based on your country, which, Islamically, we may not 100% agree with, because we believe that, we're Muslim first, then we're Arab. So we began seeing this very much Arab nationalist, my country over everything else, my Arabness before everything else, beginning to really get popular in this part of the world. And after this, as I mentioned, a lot of disunity in the Ummah, a lot of coups, a lot of corruption since 1920, when the Ottoman Caliphate began to sort of fall. But specifically, there was a planned attack by the state of Israel on sort of, the Arab lands that actually resulted in sort of wiping out Egyptian and Syrian military, the air forces. So the Israeli forces, they actually conducted raids in the West Bank villages, which were actually at the time ran by Jordan. The Egyptian forces were sort of separated from Israel by the UN troops until Egypt actually blockaded the shipping for Israeli shipping and resources. And Israel actually suggested the US needs to also blockade against Egypt. The goal basically was, at the end of the day, Israel wanted to kind of take back territory and take land and take territories from the Muslims and from the Arabs, for of course resources to of course displace Muslims and Arabs, but also for power in the region. And there's actually a resolution called UN Resolution 242, and it calls withdrawal of the Israelis from the territories in exchange for Arab recognition of the Israeli right to exist. But this resolution wasn't ever fully actualized. The UN Resolution 242 called for some peace, but it didn't actually end up working out. And basically, the result of this war was that Israel, if you look at the map, Israel is able to sort of defeat Egypt, they're able to defeat Jordan, and they're able to defeat Syria. And on the green map, or the map, the blue land is sort of the state of the Zionist government as of 1948 and after. And what we see is that in the green lands were sort of the land that was once time period controlled by countries like Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. But as a result of this war, just in 6 days, so it's also known as the 6-Day War, just in 6 days, all the green land became Israel's for the time being. So if you look at the top right, Golan Heights, that was once Syria's at this time, but now it became Israel's. The West Bank, as you probably know from currently ran by Palestine, it was, controlled by Jordan, but as a result of this war, it became Israel's. And the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula all became under Israeli and Zionist power as well. Two main takeaways from this war that you need to know is that the West Bank in Gaza became the largest prison on earth from this point onward. It was under Israeli control, Israeli, Zionist power, which, was clearly impacted the Muslims and the Arabs and the Palestinians negatively in this area. And additionally, we know that Arab nationalism, although it's powerful individually, we know that Egypt is very strong on its own, Jordan is very strong on its own, and Syria is very strong on its own. It's not sustainable by itself. We need to perhaps go back to this whole idea of Islamic unity and that we're all one ummah, as opposed to, oh, I'm from Egypt, I'm from Jordan, I'm from India, I'm from Pakistan. These are the main takeaways from the June War, also known as the 6-Day War. And only a couple years later, 7 years later, was actually the Yom Kippur War, also known as the Ramadan War or the 1973 War. And it was a surprise attack by the Arab forces against the Zionist government that actually fell in during Ramadan. And as we know in Islamic history, Ramadan is a month of victory. You know, the time in which the Prophet was, revealed the Quran, but also many other famous battles that occurred during the time of the Sahaba, Ajma'in, anhum, and other, later important figures in Islamic history. So we know that Ramadan is a month of victory for the Muslims, and it's a month in which the non-Muslims really hate, because they know that Allah helps us when we try to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as a result, we see that there was definitely some success from this war. First and foremost, Egypt, the military, was able to liberate the eastern bank of the Suez Canal and crossed over the part of the Sinai. So the part that was actually originally part of Israel as of the last war, after they took it over, that Egypt was actually able to take it back during this war. It's actually very important because it goes to show that with the help of Allah, we see that clear benefit in the world. And on top of that, though, Egypt making a lot of success and a lot of impact getting land back. But what happened was that there was a military air bridge to the Israeli military from the Western powers, US and the UK, that actually prevented from Egypt completely winning this war. And because of the help from these other countries and this military air bridge to Israeli military, Egypt and Israel had to sit down and negotiate. And what is important to notice is that Egypt and these Muslim countries and the Arab countries had to negotiate with people like Golda Meir, who was on the right side. She was the leader of Israel during this war. And she is very much a criminal, very much a violent person, and really very much an evil person. And one of her most famous quotes is that there was no such thing as Palestinians. And what we know by this is that the Israeli state, the Zionist state, their leaders always spewing propaganda and lies that are dehumanizing and sort of, not even showing or not even like agreeing that Palestinians are even a real people. To them, Palestinians aren't even a human. They're not anything. There's no identity for them. To them, they're probably like animals. And this is unfortunate to this day still that the Israeli leadership hold this opinion. And why I mention this is because now imagine you're a part of Arab, the Egyptian military, you're the Egyptian leadership. You have to sit down with these people who are crazy. You have to sit down with these people who are evil. You have to sit down with these people who are, very violent criminals and try to negotiate for justice and negotiate for the truth. And this is the sort of a common theme we see since 1948 to this day, 75 years later, when anyone tries working with the Israeli government or the Zionist government. But these negotiations, the first main one that came about from all this was in 1978. So in 1978, there was an agreement between Egypt and Israel because they were the two main countries sort of going back and forth militarily. And this agreement was sort of brokered by the US President Jimmy Carter. The main sort of conclusion from this was that the agreement really favored the interests of the US and favored the interests of Israel, while neglecting, Palestinian self-determination, liberation, sovereignty, and sort of independence. That being said, one of the other main results of this agreement was that Israel agreed to kind of withdraw military forces and Zionist and Jewish people from the Sinai Peninsula, which they had occupied in 1967. So Egypt already began taking back that land during 1973 war. And in 1978, Israel had agreed to take out completely all of their people from that part of the land. But the one important thing to notice is that from this agreement, Egypt had to formally recognize the state of Israel. And what that means is that Egypt was neutralized. Egypt can no longer fight for the Palestinians 100% in the same way they're doing prior to 1978, because now they've already agreed that Israel exists and has legitimacy and is a real country in their eyes. So now it's going to be more difficult to go back on their word or even sort of work for the Palestinians, because now on paper they've written down, we agree that Israel is a recognized state in our eyes. So that's very important to note, because although there were some benefits from this agreement and from the Camp David Accords in 1978, there are also a lot of trade-offs, the ones that I shared right now. And to end with sort of what does it look like all now? So we know that we had Nakba in 1948, which resulted in a lot of the Palestinian land being taken away from the Israeli and Zionist forces. And through the different wars, like in 1967, we saw some more land being taken away by the Palestinians. And now today, in 2024, almost all the land of Palestine is under Zionist control or is occupied by Zionists, whether it's completely ran by the government of Israel or there is Palestinians living in those areas like in the green and the gray, but are actually all occupied by the Israeli government. So all in all, the main summary from this is that over time, we see that certain political decisions, certain political personalities and figures resulted in slowly but surely land being taken away from the Palestinians and eventually sort of working against the favor of the Muslims, the Arabs, and the Palestinians. This sort of ends my part of the presentation. So again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. And hopefully you learn sort of what were the main political historical events that resulted in what we see today in the land of Palestine. But thank you so much, and I'll pass it back on to, I guess, Dr. Muhammad, inshallah.